Hi guys, it's me, Mr. Bertoch, your incredibly handsome science teacher. And in this video, we're going to talk about evolution. Well, this is going to be an interesting video to record because I don't script these at all. I just kind of go through and barf up what I know out of my mind onto the screen. And this is a controversial issue, evolution. And this is a controversial issue, evolution. And it should be controversial because there are some people on one side of the debate who say that evolution is an absolute, that it absolutely happened, that there is no doubt, no question. They'll say it's only a theory because that's what we call things in science, but it's actually a fact. And that's kind of a closed-minded position. There are those who say that creationism is an absolute. It's an absolute fact that there's a creator of some sort, a god or some sort of creator that created the earth, and evolution didn't happen. And that's a different perspective that some hold that is a very strongly held perspective. Here's the deal. Science is supposed to be about having an open mind, not a closed mind. In science, we are supposed to seriously consider all options. Unfortunately, in this particular issue, both sides are pretty unwilling to look at the positions that the other side has. And so, for example, those who believe in evolution, I will call them evolutionists. I don't mean to say that in a derogatory way. I'm just going to call them evolutionists because that's what they are. Those who believe in evolution, the evolutionists, absolutely reject out of hand any sort of intervention from a creator. And that's a closed-minded position. And because they reject it out of hand, they refuse to look at any evidence that would support creationism. And that leads them there, because they don't have an open mind, they are unable to see how certain evidence might actually support creationism. They just out of hand say, nope, I don't believe in creationism. It isn't a thing. So whatever evidence I see, no matter what it suggests, I'm going to attribute it to evolution, period. I'm going to stuff it in there and make it support evolution in my mind, and that's that. And on the other side of the issue with creationism, we can do the same thing. The creationists, and again, I don't say that in a derogatory sort of a way. In fact, I would put myself in that category as a creationist. Creationists who believe in creationism sometimes reject evolution out of hand without even considering it. And so we will say, well, everything I see points to there being a God. And so I am going to stuff all the evidence into that category and twist it and turn it and make it support my position instead of having an open mind. So again, in science, we are supposed to have an open mind. We're supposed to not have preconceived biases. We're supposed to be able to simply gather the knowledge around us, the evidence that we see, the observations that we make, and then let them lead us to a conclusion. And both sides in this particular debate are guilty of not doing that. Evolutionists will claim that they are scientists and that their positions are based on science, while the evolutionists will say about the creationists that they are non-scientific, that they're rejecting science, and they'll even make fun of creationists sometimes, when the reality is the evolutionist is doing the very same thing, and actually often to a much more biased degree, because they flat out refuse to look at in any shape or form there being any kind of a creator. And the creationist does the same thing sometimes to the evolutionist, looking at them and saying, how do you not see the evidence all around us that there is a creator? So in this video, I'm going to talk about evolution, but I'm going to talk about it as honestly as I can, showing both the evidence that supports it and also the evidence that doesn't support, I guess you might say, the evidence that that would seem to indicate that evolution didn't occur. If you talk to an evolutionist, they're going to say there is no such thing as evidence against evolution, but that's just because they're being closed-minded. Truly and really it is. It's because they don't believe in a God or a creator, and they just flat out refuse under any circumstances to acknowledge such a thing. And likewise, I'm going to be honest from the perspective of evolution and say, look, here's some evidence that might actually support the theory of evolution. And, as a creationist, and which again, I would put myself in that category, it's okay to still look for, if you believe in a God, as I actually do, it's okay to look for how did he do it, or what was the process, what tools were used. Is evolution a tool that the creator used? I don't know. It's possible, but to have an open mind about it and to say, maybe this evidence does say that that is how the universe was created. So let's start with what the theory of evolution is, essentially, in a nutshell. The theory of evolution teaches or suggests that life started spontaneously in some ancient era on the earth, a couple billion years ago-ish, give or take. Life sparked into existence, and we call that a biogenesis, which is technically not part of the theory of evolution, but it is closely related in that it provides scientists with a starting point. From there, then evolution can take over. Life sparked into existence as a very basic cell of some sort, and then from thence, all life evolved from that first living thing in some ancient ocean on Earth. All living things evolved. Now, how did they evolve? Well, according to the theory of evolution, different environmental factors affect the living thing, causing it to change. Well, I'm being very simplistic in that explanation. I'll come back to how those changes occur through mutations on the level of DNA in just a minute. But essentially, the living thing, its DNA changes, and so it changes, and that causes it to evolve, to adapt to its environment. And over billions of years of adapting and adapting and adapting, all these little niches, all over niche, which is a fancy word. You have to have your pinky out and drink some water in a fancy glass when you say niche. All the different niches were ultimately filled, and things evolved like lions and mushrooms from the same their same original ancestor. And so in evolution, we look at a tree of life. We imagine a giant tree of life with many branches, and we place all the living things onto that tree of life, based on how they're related. And so as I come in, each time a branch comes together, I'm finding a common ancestor of two different organisms. And as I go down the tree and down the trunk, eventually I get to that very first living thing that sparked into existence in the ancient ocean. And so the theory of evolution states that everything is related. We are all one family of life, that the great, 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 a bazillion great grandpa of you is also the bazillionth great, great, great grandpa of a squirrel, but also of a banana and bacteria, that we all have a common ancestor if we go back far enough. Okay, so that's, in a nutshell, the theory of evolution. This theory of evolution was originally suggested by a guy named Charles Darwin. And Mr. Darwin was actually a very intelligent man. And he lived in England and Great Britain. And he went to this place on a ship called the Galapagos Islands, where there are turtles. I used to love to watch those nature videos when I was a kid about the turtles on the Galapagos Islands. But he went there and on an expedition, and he noticed some interesting things. He noticed that there were several finches that flew around the island that were all related. Well, okay, wait, they seem to be related to each other. He noticed as he explored the island, he took notes, and he noticed that some of the finches had beaks with shapes that allowed them to eat certain kinds of things, and other finches had different shaped beaks that allowed them to eat other things. And each one was just a little bit different than the other one. And it was almost like you could see a connection from finch to finch to finch, but then as you went across the line, they got further and further separated in how they were different from each other. And so he thought about that for a while, and I thought, it seems like these finches have all evolved from one common ancestor. And he wrote a paper about it, and that kind of sparked the idea of natural selection, which I will be talking about in a lot more detail in another video. But essentially the idea that things change over time as a result of survival, what he called survival of the fittest, the most fit baby finch. So a mom and a dad finch have some baby finches, right? And they're like, oh, look at my adorable baby finches in the nest. But some of them are a little bit better at surviving than others. And the ones who are the bestiest at surviving are the ones who live and go on to reproduce. And because they reproduce, then they pass their traits on. They're a little bit better lenified traits, bestliernessified traits to the next generation of baby finches. And then those ones, the ones with the best traits, are the ones that survive and pass them on, and so on and so forth, generation after generation, getting better and better and better and better and better, 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 foreverlies and everlies. And that is how the best traits are passed on. And the traits that aren't so effective eventually die off because they're less likely to survive. And the birds with those traits don't reproduce as much. And so those traits disappear. An example of this actually occurring that we can witness and we can see, and this is where I'm saying I'm being honest, okay? Evidence that this has actually occurred would be with a specific type of moth that in Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution, there was, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the buildings, the trees, had a light color, and there was a moth that lived and was mostly white in color, and because it was camouflaged, and so it would hide on the trees. It would sit on the trees, and it would blend in, and it would make it so it didn't stand out, and the birds couldn't see it very well. Every once in a while, there would be one or two that would be born a little bit darker, and they would stand out more, and that would make them targets. And the birds would be like, "Ooh, look at that delicious moth over there. He looks so delicious. I'm going to gobble him up." And so the darker ones would be gobbled up, and the lighter ones that were more camouflaged would blend in better, and they were more likely to survive. Well, during the Industrial Revolution, what happened? That there was a lot of coal burning and like great billowing factories that were spewing out smoke all over the communities. And that smoke was beginning to coat things like trees and buildings and stuff and making them a darker color. Well, now suddenly the darker moths had an advantage. And so what happened? Well, now the lighter moths stand out, and the birds are like, "Oh, look at all those moths." And they ate the lighter ones, but didn't eat the darker ones nearly as much. The darker ones, because they had an advantage, survived. And so the darker ones over time took over. And for a very long time, the population of moths became mostly dark colored moths because the lighter ones were getting eaten, and the darker ones were the ones that were surviving and passing on their traits. And then people were like, I'm tired of all this smoke in the air. Let's be cleaner. And they, over time, got their factories so that they were polluted a lot less. The air became clean. The trees now weren't covered in all this soot and smoke and grime. And so what happened? Well, now suddenly the dark ones stand out. And so the lighter, those few who were lighter, still, they were the ones that were able to reproduce the most and hide, and the darker ones got gobbled up. And so now, once again, the moth population has gone back to mostly a lighter color. And so there is evidence supporting the idea that traits that are beneficial are passed on, while traits that are not quite so beneficial make you a target, maybe, and aren't passed on. And that perhaps that is one way that animals change over time. And we see evidence that happens. Another place where we see evidence of animals changing over time would be with your adorable and cute and snuggly puppy dogs. And dogs have changed not through natural selection, but through artificial selection. And I will talk about artificial selection in another video as well. But and dogs started as wolves, probably, and over time became cute, adorable, fat puppies who lick your face and give you sad eyes when you don't give them your piece of chicken that is on your plate, making you feel like a jerk. And they've gone from wolves to all kinds of shapes. I mean, everything from a chihuahua. All chihuahuas should be stepped on because they are obnoxious. I'm sort of kidding. Like what, a giant mastiff or a Saint Bernard. I mean, they take so many shapes and sizes and colors, and those are definite changes that have occurred because humans have interfered and bred them for certain traits. So again, showing that an animal's form and color and size and shape can change, and actually change quite quickly. I mean, we're talking only about a few thousand years based on specific circumstances surrounding it. But remember, we're being honest on both sides. So now let's look at the evidence that says, well, wait a minute. There's controverting evidence that this is not maybe something that is because of evolution. And I would simply offer this. In the case of the moth and in the case of the cute, adorable puppy, they never changed species. They never turned into something new, right? The moth remained a moth. It just changed colors. The dog remained a dog. It's still a wolf. It's just a cuter, more adorable, more loving version of a wolf that doesn't, instead of biting your face off, licks your face off. But it's still the same thing. So, yes, we see things can change shapes and size, etc. We see that with people, right? We see that with vegetables and things. We'll talk about that when we go through the artificial selection video, but that doesn't. They didn't turn into. We don't have any. We have never seen in the history of science one species suddenly turn into and become another species. What happens? Why does evolution occur in your body? In your cells. Your body's made up of cells, right? We talk about that in the cells video. And deep in your cells, in the nuclei of your cells, there is something called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. And the DNA is what controls how you grow. The DNA is the blueprint for how you grow. And whatever the DNA says, that's what's going to happen. So if it says to grow 27 feet tall, well, you're going to be really big, but that's what you're going to do, right? It never says that about anything. Well, not people anyway. I guess there are things that are 27 feet long, but not people. But if it says, you should have blue eyes, then you're going to have blue eyes, or you should have green eyes. Whatever the DNA says, that is what's going to happen. So because the DNA controls how you grow, if a change happens to the DNA, then you're going to change because that's what's controlling how you grow. So your DNA, every time your cells divide, your cells reproduce by dividing. Okay, you're constantly, right now, all of your body cells are dividing. Every time your cells divide, your DNA is replicated. It's copied. And when it is copied, it's almost always copied correctly. But sometimes it isn't copied correctly. Sometimes it's copied incorrectly, and we call that a mutation. And most mutations are either neutral, the vast majority actually are neutral, some are bad, and some are good. If they are neutral, they don't do anything. They don't cause any negative or positive effects. If they are bad, they can cause things like cancer or miscarriage if they are in a fetus, and so the thing doesn't survive. Very occasionally, it's like a good thing. It's a great. It gives you a little bit of an advantage, perhaps. And if that mutation is an advantage, and if it happens in the gametes, in the sex cells, the cells that happen to have to do with reproduction, and it's passed on to the next generation, then maybe it's a slight advantage. So an example of that would be with bears. So let's suppose there's a population of brown bears, and they live in a cold place where there's a lot of snow. And one day there is a cell that is copied incorrectly, just barely, just slightly, and it happens to make the resulting baby bear white. And that baby bear now has DNA because the DNA says make white fur, then it grows white fur. The DNA is what's controlling how it grows. So if the DNA says grow brown fur, it's going to grow brown fur. If the DNA has mutated and that mutation results in white fur, then that bear's going to have white fur. Well, let's suppose he lives where it's cold and snowy, and now he has white fur. That's an advantage because that's camouflage. And so he's going to have an advantage, and he's going to probably be able to be more stealthy and sneak up on the delicious prey and gobble it up. And if he does that, he's going to get more food, right? And he or she is going to be more likely to grow up and reproduce. Well, if it grows up and reaches a point where it can reproduce, what's going to happen? It's going to pass that mutation on to the next generation, and the next generation is going to then also have white fur, and they're going to have a little bit of an advantage. And they're going to pass it on, and eventually it's going to spread throughout the bear population, and more bears are going to have white fur, and fewer bears are going to have brown fur. And for a while, this species is going to have both, but eventually the one with the white fur will take over, the ones with the brown fur will disappear, and the entire species will end up having white fur because of a random genetic mutation. So these mutations happen all the time in organisms, and very often they result in like a miscarriage. They result in the organism growing in a way that isn't better, or that's neutral. But every so often it might result in an advantage, and if it's an advantage, then it would be passed on to the next generation, and that would result in an advantage that spreads throughout the rest of the species. So many scientists believe that these mutations occur gradually over time at an even killed pace. Over billions of years, that species are gradually changing. More and more, though, scientists are starting to suggest that maybe instead of a slow change, that changes occur suddenly, and that we would call that punctuated equilibrium. So here's what that means. Punctuated equilibrium. That is a big sciencey word that means that changes occur in reaction to changes in the environment, which don't happen often. So you might go millions of years where the environment is pretty steady in a particular place. You might have, for example, a rainforest, and it stays a rainforest for a long, long time. But then suddenly the climate, for some reason, changes. And what was a rainforest, I don't know, it becomes something else. It becomes a savanna or something. And the trees all quickly die. And when I say quickly, I'm not like saying instantly, I'm saying across thousands of years, but still, that's quickly in terms of geologic time. The trees die, the forest disappears, and suddenly that animal that used to live in the trees doesn't have access to trees anymore. And so it has to evolve, has to change, has to adapt. And so instead of a gradual change across the last several million years when it had trees to support it, they didn't need to adapt. And so those mutations that were occurring randomly, they were mostly discarded because they didn't give it any sort of advantage. But now that the trees are gone, if some babies are born with some advantages due to random mutations occurring, but those random mutations that would give it an advantage on the ground, those would be the ones that would be passed on to future generations. And over a very short period of time, over a few thousand years or so, the creature that was a tree-dwelling creature now adapts to being a land-dwelling creature. So that is punctuated equilibrium. It means that, according to this theory, evolution tends to reach a period of equilibrium. Equilibrium means balance. So the creatures are balanced, and then, or the species, and then some event comes along that changes the balance. It says, nope, bam, goodbye trees, and no longer is the species in balance with its environment. There's no longer an equilibrium. The equilibrium is punctured, and because of that, the species evolves once again very quickly into a new species. And scientists would suggest that this is why in the fossil record, we tend not to see a gradual change, which is what we don't see. In the fossil record, we don't see a gradual change from species to animal, generation to generation. Instead, what we see is in one layer of rock, we see all the same types of plants and animals living in harmony for millions of years, and then suddenly they're all gone, and the next layer has a whole bunch of new plants and animals in it. And so they would say, scientists would say, the line between those two is where there was some sort of event that changed the environment, and everything that lived there had to evolve and adapt really quickly during that period of punctuated equilibrium. And because the equilibrium was punctured, they evolved accordingly and adapted. Now, the controverting evidence would be that That seems to be trying to shoehorn your evolution views into supporting the theory of evolution. Okay, because the evidence shows that one layer of rock is full of all kinds of life that stayed the same for thousands or even millions of years, and then a rock layer above it shows that there's a whole bunch of new things. And that's pretty good evidence that there may have been a creator that came along and said, let's take these species out. The earth is now ready for a new set of species. Blump, let's wipe these species out and let's put these species here. And coming up with the theory of punctuated equilibrium kind of is maybe you refusing to see that there is a creator and insisting on shoehorning in your theories of evolution and justifying and saying, well, yeah, there's no connection between these species in this layer and these species in this layer, but here's why. So, just again, important to look at both sides and be honest and let the actual facts lead you where you go. Another form of evidence that evolutionists will put out there that is good and strong evidence is the idea of vestigial organs and vestigial DNA code. And so this is something we need to look at and talk about and consider. And again, allow ourselves to draw conclusions based on the data that we and the evidence that we see. So vestigial organs and vestigial DNA code. Well, vestigial is a big fancy sciencey word that basically means leftovers. It basically means like on Thanksgiving dinner, you have so many, you eat so much food, and you have leftovers, and you put them in the fridge, right? And if we look at living things, like you and I, for example, there are leftovers on our bodies. For example, right here in the corner of your eye, if you feel both corners, you have these little bumps there. Well, what are those bumps? Why do you have bumps right there? You have them on this corner, but you don't have them out here on that corner. Feel this corner out here. It's nice and smooth. But this one that's got a lump there. What is that lump of lumpiness that is in the corner of your eye? That lumpy lump is a vestigial organ. It's an eyelid, believe it or not. You have a shriveled up eyelid there. So you have 3 eyelids per eye. You have the top eyelid, the bottom eyelid, and you have the corner eyelid. And this one comes across the eye sideways and is your built-in goggles. If you've ever seen a lizard, how it can go and it can pull a see-through eyelid across its eye to make it waterproof, you have that. It's right there. It's in the corner of your eye. So why don't you go ahead and use it for me right now? Go ahead and blink that eyelid, would you? Well, you can't because it's vestigial. It doesn't work anymore. Okay, the eyelid's actually there. You actually have it. And when if you go to somebody who has passed away and you take tweezers, you can actually pull it out. Don't do that to somebody who's alive because they will scream in horrifying pain. But if they're passed on, then they're not going to scream. And it fits right across the entire eye, and it is a see-through membrane. It's an eyelid. It's there. You have it in your body right now. But you have to wear goggles if you are on the swim team or you're at the pool, because you can't use it because the muscle that controls it is gone. The muscle we've lost that muscle. But that's a leftover organ. Evolutionists would say from when our great-great-great-grandpa was a lizard. And it left over, but no longer functioning. Other examples of vestigial organs would be a well. A well is well when he is well. Whales are mammals. They are not fish, right? And so are dolphins. They are mammals. They once, their great-great-grandpa, it is believed, lived on land. And whales have leftover leg bone in their body that they don't have a leg. but the femur, there's a tiny little bone and it's not used for anything. It's just sitting in their bodies, unused for their entire lives. Another example would be the little feetsies of pythons. Python, it's a snake. I have one. Her name is Lady Fluffington. Her name used to be Lord Fluffington until she laid eggs, and I realized she was in fact a girl. Great story. One of my students named Caitlin, who doesn't, I'm not allowed to tell this story when she's around because it still traumatizes her all these years later. She was holding Lord Fluffington, and Lord Fluffington laid eggs on her. And then we found out it was Lady Fluffington, and that was awesome and funny. But anyway, Lady Fluffington, the python, has little tiny feet. And those are, Lady Fluffington is a snake, but she has little tiny feet. And those are vestigial. They are leftover feet from Lady Fluffington's great-great-great-grandpa, the lizard, or whatever. Okay, that would have had feet a long time ago, but they are no longer used. The same thing happens with DNA code. If we look at the DNA of an animal or a plant or whatever, we can see code that is no longer used that is similar to code that is used by other organisms. And we can trace the evolution in the DNA from animal to animal or plant to plant going back in time. We can see a connection from animal and plant in the DNA. There is vestigial code, DNA code, that is no longer used, but is there, and it's just cast off. It's off to the side. Or we can see how mutations have occurred and track those mutations through the code, because the code of a human is very similar to the code of a chimpanzee, for example. And parts of the code that are no longer used, like the parts that make plants or that do things that plants need but are still in us, are those, that DNA code. Why would it be there? Why would we have code in our DNA that is coding for things we don't do, we don't need? Well, the evolutionists would say, well, that's evidence of evolution. That's strong evidence. Vestigial organs and vestigial code in our DNA would be evidence that we evolved from other things, because otherwise, why would we have a non-functioning eyelid in the corner of our eye? Why would we have leftover code from things long ago that other species use, but we don't use, but we have that code in our DNA just sitting there dormant? Why is that the case? Let's talk about now controverting evidence of vestigial organs and vestigial DNA. So here's the deal. I am a programmer. And one of the things, I am a scientist. Well, I have 2 degrees in science. I have 3 degrees altogether. 2 are in science, 1's in curriculum development. But I also have spent many years programming, and once built a very big online portal, educational portal that had games and things. And I programmed all of that, or I led the teams that programmed them. But I did a lot of the code writing myself. And I understand how code works. So DNA is a type of code. And whatever the DNA says, the body follows it. Just like whatever a computer program, whatever the code says in a computer program, the computer follows it exactly, specifically. It does what the code says. Well, when I am writing code, because I am lazy, I don't ever write the code from scratch. Well, I did early in my career, but then I ended up with what I call a code repository. After years of writing code, I ended up with this massive code library, or a code repository, that I still have, I keep. Because when I have a project where I have to write code, I don't want to go write 10,000 lines of code that I've already written. I go into my code repository, or even I go online sometimes and I find somebody else's code repository, because there are a lot of code libraries out there, and I take what somebody else wrote and I incorporate it into my project. I take an object or some sort of class or something that somebody else wrote, and I put it into my project. But here's the deal. That code isn't going to do exactly what I need. It might be close, but it might not do exactly the exact precise thing that I need it to do. And so what do? I go into the code that I just stole from another project, and I comment out the parts I don't want. That means that I put a couple of slash marks in front of it, or there's other ways to comment things out. Basically, I turn the code off. I don't delete the code. I leave it in my project. I just comment it out. I leave it. I mark it so that that's ignored by the computer program. The computer program jumps over it, and then I will go through the object or class or function or whatever I stole or used from another project, and I'll rewrite parts of it slightly. But here's the deal. Well, okay, actually, let me say this too. And then so I'll adapt the code, and it will work for my project, and it will do whatever I need it to do, like a shopping cart. Why am I going to rewrite a shopping cart if I already wrote one? If my new project also needs a shopping cart, I'm going to take one I already had in another project. I'm going to comment out the parts I don't need because maybe it doesn't quite need to do exactly what it did in the other project. And I'm going to alter some parts, and to the end user, that shopping cart's gonna look like it was built just specifically for that project. But if you go into my code, you're gonna see all kinds of old code commented out and rewritten, and there will be evidence that will tie it back to a former project. If you look at the code, you're gonna see evidence that I stole that code from another project. And in a future project, I might steal it again from this project and do the same thing. Comment out the parts I don't want, rewrite the parts I do want, and you'll see, again, a history tying one project to another, to another, to another, going backwards through my code and through my code repository. Wouldn't a creator work the same way? Wouldn't a creator be efficient? Why would a creator rewrite code for every project from scratch? That doesn't make sense. And even if I were to write all the code from all my projects from scratch, which would be very inefficient. Okay, I wouldn't be working efficiently if I did it that way. But even if I did, because I'm the same creator of my code, I'm still going to have a lot of things in common because I think the same way. I'm going to solve problems in my programming the same way or similar ways. And so there would be similar code anyway. But I don't write code that way because I want to be efficient and fast. And so I'm just going to go into my code repository, and I'm going to pluck out the parts of the code that I need and put them into my project, comment out the parts I don't want, and leave vestigial code in my code and rewrite the parts I do need and make it fit into my project. And I would argue strongly that a creator would do the same thing. An intelligent creator, DNA is a code, and it is code. It's programming code. It's just biological code. Why would an intelligent creator not have a code repository? Of course they're going to. Why would they not work efficiently? If me, being a lowly, handsome science teacher, if I have a code repository, if I'm smart enough to have a code repository to make me efficient, then I would argue that a creator, of course, is going to work efficiently as well, and also have a code repository and take code from the code repository when you need to have eyes, or when a species needs to whatever, make a certain type of protein. And the creator is going to say, okay, well, I already wrote this code for this protein. So I'm going to go into my code repository, and I'm going to grab that out, and I'm going to put it into the DNA code of this new species I'm making, except that, I need it to be just tweaked a little bit. So I'm going to comment out these parts of the DNA code, vestigial code, and I am going to alter it a little bit, and bam, now this protein does exactly what I need it to do. And yeah, okay, it left lizard eyelids in the corner, but who cares? They're just little bumps. and it was a much more efficient way to write the code. And so, and I worked efficiently, and I made this species, and voila, there you go. So again, looking at all sides of the debate is important, okay, and not drawing conclusions that evolution isn't absolute, because then you shut your mind off to other possibilities, or vice versa. Okay, it's important to look at all sides of the evidence and allow the evidence to lead you where it will lead you. And I will just say that I would absolutely expect, if I were looking for a creator, I would absolutely expect that they would work efficiently. I would absolutely expect. I would think it would be well, I'll just say I would expect a creator to have to work efficiently and to use code in an efficient way. And so if I were looking for a creator, I would expect to see vestigial code. I would expect to see code commented out. Based on my understanding of programming, that's what I would expect an intelligent programmer to do, is to leave vestigial code. So vestigial code, in my opinion, is not evidence of evolution so much as evidence of an intelligent creator, or at least it can be both. It can both show, it can be used as evidence by evolutionists, but it's also exactly what I would expect to see from a creator writing code intelligently and efficiently. So far we've looked at evolution and what is the theory of evolution, what are the processes that drive evolution forward via natural selection. And we've talked about, oh, you know what? We never talked about convergent versus divergent evolution. We should do that real quick. So convergent evolution and divergent evolution. Scientists talk about how sometimes things evolve away. Remember I talked about a tree of life, and any point where the branches come together, that's where there's a common ancestor, right? And then from that common ancestor, the species over time diverge further and further, becoming more and more distinct from one another. This often happens when, like for example, in a certain area, maybe a mountain range comes up and divides a population. So maybe you have one species of zebra, and then a mountain range comes up between them, and the two zebras populations are now separated for millions of years, and they evolve in different ways, and they diverge from each other, becoming two different species. That's divergent evolution. Convergent evolution means they converge, they come closer together. Okay, this can happen when two species don't live in the same place. They are not related at all, but they evolve very similarly because of similar circumstances. For example, a desert in North America is very, very similar to a desert in, say, Australia. And so there's going to be let's go with South America. There's going to be similar conditions. And so animals that have never come into contact with each other at all, yet they will evolve very similar features, not because they are related, but because they are because they're responding to the same or very similar sets of circumstances. And so you might get two animals that even look almost identical, or plants that look almost identical, but that's because of convergent evolution and not because they actually have a common ancestor. They don't have common DNA that you can trace. So that's convergent and divergent evolution. Now, we have tried to look at this honestly. and evaluate, because we are scientists and we are trying to be intelligent and we are trying to have an open mind. And so we don't want to be like those who say there is only evolution. We don't want to be also closed-minded on the other side. We want to look at all the evidence and take it in and say, okay, here is where the evidence leads me. Let me conclude this very, very long video with one final bit of evidence that for me is the one that tips me over to the side of creationism. And just it makes me think, well, this piece of evidence seems very much to suggest that evolution didn't occur, because it wouldn't be this way if evolution had occurred. And that is simply this. The theory of evolution states that all life started from a common spark. I talked about that at the beginning of this extra long video, that a common spark, like life, and everything evolved from that thing. But here's the deal. Life has been on the earth for billions of years. And if we look at living things, we look at all of the DNA of every bacteria on earth, and every plant, and every mushroom, and every human, and all the things, all the animals, all of them, the DNA is closely related. We can see that vestigial code that I talked about throughout the entire, all life on earth. All of us seem to share a common ancestor if you are looking at that vestigial DNA code. That doesn't make sense. And I'm sorry, but it doesn't. Okay? Because, I mean, let's think about this logically. If life happened once, if there was a single spark, then it should have happened twice, and it should have happened 3 times, and it should have happened 10 times. In the billions of years that have occurred, there should have been multiple sparks of life. It doesn't make sense that it would happen a single time. So all DNA, the fact that all DNA and all species is closely related, that more suggests a code repository from a creator and not a DNA. I mean, not evolution. Because if evolution occurred, there should be multiple family trees. There should be a family tree over here that are all related to each other. And then from that spark of life. And then over here, another spark of life happened, and there's a bunch of organisms there that are related. And there should be 100 of those or 1,000 of those. Something doesn't just happen once. In science, things should be repeatable, and they should occur multiple times. A single spark of life doesn't make any sense. That is very strong, too strong for me, evidence that evolution did not occur. If life sparked into existence once, it should have sparked into existence 1,000 times. It's once doesn't work. It's 1,000 times or it's 0 times. For it to happen once, for there to be one repository of code that all things share, to me, that is almost insurmountable evidence that there is, in fact, a creator, and he's using a repository code, a code repository, rather than evolution happening from a spark of life. Nothing in this universe happened once. Even the most rare events happen over and over and over again. Okay, time is so immense and the universe so big that even the most rare events happen over and over and over again. To have a spark of life happen a single time, and in the vast oceans of the earth across billions of years, it should be ongoing today even. If it happened back then, why is it not happening today? Why are sparks of life not coming into existence still? Why is there not, the one that happened 2 billion years ago, and then the one that happened 10,000 years ago, and the one that happened 100 years ago? Why are not new types of cells sparking into existence, or new forms of life sparking into existence all the time? You can't have one spark. That's illogical to me. So I look at the evidence and I say, I can see the arguments that evolutionists are making, but I can also use all of those arguments to support creationism. And it seems much more likely to me, based on the evidence that I am looking at, that life came from a creator. Now, maybe he used evolution. Maybe that was the tool he used. And maybe the reason there was only one spark was because he was the one who sparked it, and he only sparked it once. That's a logical conclusion to make. But it seems illogical to me to say that something randomly happened once and never, ever again. So I look at the balance of all the evidence and I say, seems to me creationism wins. But it's okay if you disagree, because again, we are scientists and we don't close our minds off to possibilities. Unfortunately, many evolutionists do. They close their minds off and they say, nope, I refuse to ever consider, look at, or think about creationism. Creationism did not happen. And because they take that closed-minded attitude, they are blocking themselves from ever seeing one of the possible explanations for where life came from. And so every bit of evidence they see, no matter what, they have to shoehorn it into evolution and say, it has to fit in the evolution bucket because that's the only thing I'm willing to accept. I don't believe in a God. And so they are that closed-mindedness precludes them from seeing one of the possible truths. Science is about finding truth and figuring out what really happened, what really is how the universe came to be, how mankind came to be, how the earth came to be, and life came to be, and not to support our preconceived biases. Hi guys, thanks for watching my video. These rambling science videos where I go unscripted and just kind of barf up all the science knowledge out of my head are part of a series that go along with an online class that I teach, which you can sign up for if you go to handsomescienceteacher.com. I also have a whole bunch of free resources for homeschoolers. I have hundreds of articles on every topic that covers your entire science curriculum from 5th through 8th grade. I have online games and quizzes, all curated and written by this handsome guy, a science teacher with, well, three degrees, but 2 of them are in science. So it's targeted right to and directly to your science students. So sign up, subscribe to the channel, and I release lots of videos. Also, in addition to these ones, lots of little short videos that are like 2 minutes long that cover science topics. Those ones you don't get to see my handsome face, but they're still good videos and they're much more targeted, and those ones are scripted, so you don't have to hear me like you are right now going blah blah blah. The end. Subscribe. Thank you. Goodbye.